My name is Eric Admin, and I'm with the Sno-King Watershed Council. And this is our Introduction to Water Monitoring class. What we're going to go over this evening is we're going to talk about the who, what, where, when, why, and how of water monitoring. We'll cover some basics about watersheds and types of water pollution. We'll talk about regulation of water quality, and we'll talk about steps in getting started water monitoring. And we'll also give you some additional resources and talk about what your next steps might be. So first of all, just a little bit about myself. My connection to local streams is that I moved to streamside property back in 1998. My wife and I did, and we live on Little Swamp Creek. And we've learned a lot about creeks because of the fact that we live on the creek. We've learned that there's a lot of wildlife and just a lot of really great things about living on a creek. And we've also learned that creeks have some issues. So this is the one time we saw actually like a large salmon come up our creek. We typically don't see that, but there's a lot of other things that live in a creek. So as I mentioned, living on the creek, we kind of saw the good and the bad. So we've also experienced some flooding, some high turbidity events. And so we've learned that local creeks also have some issues. So let's talk about water monitoring. So essentially what water monitoring is just regular systematic assessment of different variables in conditions. It helps us to understand what's the current condition and what sort of changes are taking place. And there's a number of reasons why we would do that. So first of all, we want to find out, is it good for fish and wildlife? So like in our area, we have some endangered salmon species. So we want to know what's going on with the water quality that might affect that. And we also might want to know, is it safe for recreation contact? And we also want to know if it's changing. Is it changing at all? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? What's going on with it? So one thing that people do in local creeks and water bodies is recreation. So as a kid, I grew up locally walking, wading, playing, fishing in local creeks. And a lot of people have that kind of a shared experience. So one of the things we want to do is look at, is the water quality safe for people to get into the water? Water quality is also obviously very important for fish. And so something that can have an effect on fish locally is habitat and stormwater. So in the urban area, what we've seen is, unfortunately, salmon populations are on the decline. And some of that is a result of things that are outside the urban area, but some of that is also a result of what's happening with the water quality that's in our urban area. And as a consequence, things that affect the creeks affect the salmon, and then the trickle-down effect is it affects the things that eat the salmon. So our local streams, one of the things that they're very important for is they also serve as kind of rearing ground for salmon, and not just salmon. There's lots of things that live in the creek, but that's one of the important functions of them is they're kind of nurseries for these baby salmon. And we actually do have some salmon still coming back up in some of our urban creeks. This was a shot taken by Jeff Jensen, who has started a salmon watcher program locally after King County quit operating their salmon watcher program. And this is showing kokanee returning to Little Bear Creek in the Sammamish River, the mouth of Little Bear Creek. We're going to talk a little bit about who monitors water. There's a number of different people or groups that monitor water. One is government agencies. And so they might monitor it for a couple different reasons. One is they may monitor it for a regulatory purpose. So they may be required to monitor certain variables, or they may be just interested in whether a restoration project that they're doing is having a beneficial effect. Academic researchers also monitor water. Nonprofit groups monitor water for different reasons, and volunteers. And we'll talk about what we monitor and why. So our program is called Sno-King Water Watchers, and we're a all volunteer program. We operate primarily in Snohomish and King counties, although we keep expanding, but so far we're in Snohomish and King counties. Started back in 2015 and 2016. We got people from a group called Global Water Watch to come out and help us get the program started. And since then, we've been collecting regular data, primarily on streams, but also some rivers and lakes. And our goals with the program are provide environmental education, so to our monitors and as a consequence to people that they come in contact with, as well as to groups that we work with. We want to increase public awareness and stewardship of local creeks. And we also report issues that we might find, like high bacteria or turbidity, to agencies that might be able to do something about those issues that we find. We're part of an organization called Global Water Watch. And Global Water Watch is headquartered out of Auburn University. We just happened to get connected to Global Water Watch because I was listening to an EPA webcast one day and I heard Professor Bill Deutsch talking about a program that he'd started called Global Water Watch. And they'd also started a parallel program called Alabama Water Watch. And in Alabama, their goal was to have a water monitor on every creek and stream in Alabama. And so they have a huge network of volunteers there. They also started doing some work. This group out of Auburn started doing some work in other countries. And so they've expanded to a number of different countries around the world. And so we're kind of the Pacific Northwest node of Global Water Watch. Global Water Watch has a model that they use for community-based water monitoring. And essentially their idea is take people, give them some simple technology, use a consistent approach. You can generate credible data. With that data, there's different actions that you can take to work on improving water quality and ultimately provide watershed stewardship and better quality of life. So that's kind of just in a nutshell their model. There's different things that you can do with your data. So one of the things you can do is you could do some advocacy. So if you wanted to, you could speak to elected officials or others about things that we need to do to improve the water quality. You can also, if you identify an area that maybe would benefit from better habitat or better shading, you can get active in restoration and protection work. And you might do environmental education. Maybe you would participate with a school group, or in some other context, you could help provide some environmental education. So those are some of the things you can do with the information you learn. We teach a number of different types of monitoring. So one of them is bacteria monitoring. So we have a process that we use, and we have a whole separate class on each of these different types of monitoring. But we use a technique that's called Colascan Easy Gel. And essentially what we do is we collect samples of water, small samples, put them in with something called media, which is like a food for the bacteria, pour it into these pre-treated Petri dishes and incubate them for a given period. And then after a while, colonies grow, and you're able to count those colonies and identify what sort of bacteria you're finding. So that's one of our types of monitoring. We also do what's called water chemistry monitoring. And so we're measuring things like dissolved oxygen, temperature, pH, alkalinity, hardness, and turbidity. So this is an example of measuring turbidity. So a high turbidity event is where the water looks muddy. That's one of the types of monitoring we do. We also do stream biomonitoring. And this is a process of collecting the different types of creatures that live in the bottom of a stream And those creatures that live in the bottom of a stream are called benthic, and they don't have a skeleton, so they're an invertebrate. So benthic macroinvertebrates are these small creatures that live in the bottom of the stream, and they're indicators of water quality because they have differing levels of sensitivity to pollution. So by collecting those and categorizing how many we find that are pollution tolerant or not pollution tolerant, it gives us an idea of what's going on with the water quality. We've also got involved in another method of assessing the benthic macroinvertebrates, and that's a technique which is used more by agencies called BIBI, benthic index of biotic integrity. And in this method, you take use a very exact technique to collect sample using a particular type of net. You capture a sample in a measured area of stream bottom for a certain period of time, and then send that sample off to a taxonomic lab. And the lab, under a microscope, evaluates exactly what you have, and then they'll give you relative scores based on the different types of creatures they find and come up with a numeric index that can be used to compare different streams. This is less interesting as a volunteer activity, just because you don't actually get to see the creatures yourself that much, but it's more of a quantitative method. This year, we're adding stream flow monitoring. And so this is basically using simple tools to estimate the flow. And typically what you do for this is you measure the width of the stream at a given point, and then you measure the depth at a couple of different points, and you calculate a cross-sectional area. And you'll do that at a point upstream and a point downstream, and then you'll time how long an object takes to float down from the measured distance from the upstream to the downstream. And based on those numbers, you're able to calculate cubic feet per second. So that's something we're going to be learning how to do and practicing this year as well. And then we're also doing more of a detailed habitat assessment. So habitat assessment has to do with things like trees and shrubs in the riparian zone. The riparian zone is the area of vegetation around a stream that affects the stream. So is it barren? Is it a parking lot? Does it have a lot of trees? Does it have a lot of shrubs? How big is it? Is there good shade over the creek? Is there wood in the stream or not? Are there pools and different types of habitat? And what's the bottom like? Is it muddy? Is it silty, sandy, gravel, cobble? Those are all different variables you can look at and evaluate from year to year to see what sort of changes are happening in the stream. All right, we're going to move on to basic monitoring concepts. So the first concept is a watershed. So probably most of you are familiar with this concept of watershed, but essentially watershed is an area of land that drains to a stream or to a water body. And so, if you kind of take the high point along ridgeline surrounding an area, all that flows into a given point. That's the watershed. And you can look at watersheds on different scales. So there's what we call watersheds or basins and subbasins. So the Salish Sea is a major watershed in our area, but then we also have subbasins like the Lake Washington Cedar Sammamish watershed or the Snoqualmie Skykomish watershed. And then you can even get down into within those watersheds. For instance, the Swamp Creek watershed is a sub watershed of the Lake Washington Cedar watershed. And you can get even smaller than that. Little Swamp Creek that I live on is a sub watershed of Swamp Creek. Another basic concept with regard to water and watersheds is what's called the hydrologic cycle. And I should mention there's a little page reference on here. I'll be sending you all electronic versions of our Global Water Watch water monitoring manuals. And there's an area that talks about the hydrologic cycle, but essentially hydrologic cycle is the idea that water isn't really created it changes state and moves from place to place. So at one point, it's up in the atmosphere and it condenses out of the atmosphere as clouds form and precipitation falls on the land. And then a certain amount of that infiltrates into the ground, and a certain amount is collected in bodies of water. And then some of that will evaporate back up into the sky, and the cycle will continue. In a urban area, as opposed to a more natural area, what happens to the rainfall is very different. So in a natural watershed, a lot of the water is used by the trees, the plants, organisms in the soil. And so if you were to look at, say, a creek running through a forested area and look at what happens to the water level when it rains, it would take a long time before it really started to climb. And then it would take a long time before it started to drop, compared to an area that's mostly pavement. When it starts to rain, the level would climb dramatically, very rapidly. And then it would, when it quits raining, it'll drop very rapidly. So that's an example of the difference of the hydrologic cycle in an urban area versus a natural area. Another concept with regard to water and watersheds is just the fact that freshwater is an extremely scarce resource, and in particular, freshwater in lakes and rivers and streams is a very, very scarce resource relative to the water that's on the planet. Another concept that we cover, that we use from time to time, is this concept of stream order. And so it's a way of kind of saying, is this a headwater stream or water body, or is this something that is the result of a number of different streams or water bodies coming together? So if you have a first order stream, that's typically a headwaters type stream that doesn't have any tributaries. And then you make your way down to a larger order stream, like a third or a fourth order stream. And that's something that's been a combination of a series of first, second, third order streams. Another concept is what's called the river continuum. And this just says there's a different, if you were to characterize a river or a stream, the environment and the community change as you move downstream from the headwaters. So typically in the headwaters area of a stream, the water tends to be clearer. It's typically running faster through the environment. It might be colder. The bottom of a creek might be more rocky, and you would have certain types of creatures that are more prevalent in that part of the stream. Where you get to the downstream area, the bottom of the creek might tend to be more like sediment. It might be open, less shaded. You might have a different community of creatures that you find on the downstream end as well. So this change in the characteristic of the water body as you go from a headwaters to the mouth is this concept of the river continuum, just saying that that biological community changes. Okay, we're going to talk about different types of water pollution. So one big way of categorizing water pollution is point source versus non-point source. So point source means you can identify a particular source. It comes from a point, like a drain pipe. Non-point source means it's widely distributed. It's basically running off the landscape. Examples of different types of water pollution: sediment is actually considered a type of water pollution. This is an example of the creek that I live on after sediment's been running off of a construction site, and it's got a lot of sediment in the water. So when you find that, that's called high turbidity. And so that's considered a form of water pollution. Another type of water pollution is what are referred to as nutrients, which are mostly phosphates and nitrates. And what happens with those come from things like lawn fertilizers, and it used to come from soaps. Those can trigger too much plant growth and also algae blooms. And so those are really an issue on lakes where they have algae blooms caused by excess nutrients. And then the algae bloom causes toxic, produces toxins that can be lethal to pets and people. There's other things that run off of the roads. So oils, chemicals, a variety of different things that run off, and including tire particles. And so some of these have been implicated in urban stream mortality syndrome with salmon, where when salmon return to local streams to spawn, there's particular salmon, in particular coho salmon, seem to be the most susceptible to this, but where they would die before they spawn because they get exposed to some of these different chemicals. Another category of water pollution is pathogens. So an example of that would be E. coli bacteria, and those come from a variety of different sources. They can come from animals, they can come from failing side sewers, they can come from sewer systems, septic fields, they can come from encampments. They can come from a wide variety of things, but high levels of bacteria can make the water not safe for recreational contact. There are some things that people can do to reduce water pollution. So one is things like rain gardens, rain barrels, other things that kind of store rainwater on the landscape. Planting native plants and trees and restoring buffers along creeks is something that people can do. Picking up pet waste is something that's definitely can keep bacteria out of the water bodies. Using a car wash keeps those pollutants from getting into streams. And one thing that people are not aware of is that all the storm drains that you find on streets, ultimately those drain to a stream. So people who wash their car in their driveway and it goes into a storm drain don't really think about it, but that is it ultimately ending up in a stream. And limiting chemicals and fertilizers in your yard is another thing that people can do. So we're going to talk a little bit about laws regulating water quality. So once upon a time, there were not any laws regulating water quality. And so you had situations like this, which I think is a picture of a river called the Cuyahoga River that caught on fire at one point. And so that led to the development of something called the Clean Water Act, which essentially was the foundational clean water law nationwide. Subsequently, there's been state laws passed, and in Washington state, the Washington Administrative Code has a section that regulates fresh water, and it regulates these different variables. There's some other local regulations that also have an effect on water quality. So cities and counties periodically update what they call their comprehensive plan, and that defines land use in that city or county. And it also defines things such as buffers, how big buffers are going to be in certain zones, protection of creeks and wetlands. So that can have a huge effect. Local land use codes that talk about what can be done in terms of clearing and grading and development where it's permitted also have a big effect. There's these programs called shoreline master programs that regulate typically large water bodies that are considered to be waters of the state. So larger creeks, lakes are regulated by those. And there's also something called a NPDES permit, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, which essentially defines how cities and also how large commercial operators are going to handle their stormwater. So this is something that's required by the EPA. It's typically regulated by the State Department of Ecology in our state. And so people like a city, for instance, or a county have to prepare a plan that says, here's how we're going to deal with stormwater issues in our area. That plan has to be approved by the Department of Ecology. So that's another big set of regulations that affects water quality. And one more that actually has quite a big effect is tree ordinances, because the amount of tree retention and tree canopy in an area has quite an effect on water quality. And once you lose a certain amount of your tree canopy, then there's a relationship between how much remaining tree canopy you have and the health of a stream. And once you get below a certain point, you can't have sustainable salmon runs, for instance, in local streams. Okay, let's talk about getting started water monitoring. So first thing you're going to do is define your goals. So, what are you interested in doing with this? Do you want it to learn how to educate others? Do you want it to monitor water quality because you live on a creek and you're interested in it? What are your reasons? What do you like to do with this information? Then you want to start, once you say, okay, perhaps I live in a watershed on a particular creek, I'm going to start learning about some things that affect that creek. I want to walk up and down the length of that creek and find out where it goes. And then I want to identify some things that might be access points or things that have an impact on that creek. And then once I have this information, maybe I'll select a particular site that I think would be a good reference site for whatever reason. And we'll talk about reasons why you might select a particular site where you want to actually collect your information about that water body. Then you start collecting the data and you can put it to use. So in terms of picking a monitoring site, we use this mnemonic class, pick a monitoring site with class. So it needs to be convenient. So close to you would be an example of convenient. Legal. So if it's on private property, you need permission. Generally on public land, it's usually accessible, but you want to make sure that you have permission. You actually need to be able to get to the water body. So if you have a bridge crossing, but then you can't actually get down to the water level to conduct a sample, that might not be accessible, or it might be a good access point. You want to choose a place that's safe. So for instance, maybe if it's close to a busy road, that might be dangerous, or there's an encampment, or maybe it's very secluded. You want to make sure that the site that you pick, you're going to be safe monitoring there. And then strategic, make sure that it fits into your monitoring goals. So now you've picked your site and you're going to start monitoring, collecting, and recording data. And so first thing that we record is we use a monitoring site form, and we'll record some information about the site, who you are you monitoring with a group, or are you monitoring with our group? What is the water body and watershed, and some descriptive information, and then a latitude and longitude in a decimal format. Then you'll use data sheets, which will provide you with to record the physical, chemical, and bacteriological monitoring data that you have. And then you can enter those into the Global Water Watch database. So you'll be set up in the Global Water Watch database, where we enter information about monitors, monitoring sites, and then you're able to have your data be produced as graphs, maps, and tables. To get to this site, you can go to the Sno-King Watershed Council website, and then we have a page for water watchers, and we have a link for data entry and viewing. So if you went to that link after this class, you could look at some of the existing sites and what monitoring data has been collected for existing sites. And then you'll be given a login. So you'll log in to the Global Water Watch system. This is what it looks like when you log in. And then you'll have the opportunity to enter different types of data. Once you enter the data, you'll have a confirmation screen, and then you'll hit submit, and your record will go into the database. So now you've started monitoring, you've been collecting data for a while, maybe you want to do something in terms of interpreting and presenting that to somebody else to put the information to use. So what are some different ways that you could do that? One way that you can do it is you can use graphs that come out of the Global Water Watch system. So here's an example of a color-coded graph where it's showing, it was color-coded. So red was harmful E. coli levels, yellow was of concern, green was good. So you could use this type of a graph to help present your data. You can also come up with a report card. So you can come up with a document that just kind of shares what's going on with that water body. This is a group in Edmonds. There's a school group associated with a couple different high schools now, and they go out and monitor data monthly, and they present an annual report to the city council in Edmonds. And kids actually have a very powerful voice, and so this is a great way to get decision makers to listen to what you're finding. This was another group of youth up in Snohomish who were monitoring a water body called Blackman's Lake that's in the city of Snohomish, and they were sharing information they were finding. One of the issues that they were dealing with was high bacteria levels. So they put together a public meeting at a fire station out in Snohomish and had a very well attended public meeting and discussion to raise awareness of the issues with Blackman's Lake. This is the monitors on McSorley Creek. So they put together their own excellent graphs and information, interpretive information, and then they post this information on a signboard at Saltwater State Park. So this is another example of what you can do. So I mentioned we're going to give you some training materials. We also have, there's other resources you can get. Streamkeeper's Field Guide is a great resource available from Adopt a Stream that talks about different types of water monitoring and really how to collect data and put it to use in a very detailed manner. And this is the website where you can also get more information about Adopt a Stream. So what you can do next is learn how to do the different types of water monitoring, learn about your particular water body and watershed, think about your monitoring goals, make a plan, start monitoring, and put your data to work. Okay, I am going to stop the recording at this point and ask anybody if any has any questions at this point.